I actually had a friend that had a theory that basically what happens is he gets emasculated, like castrated, essentially. So he can't have children anymore. And that's why the whole thing with Vesper is so hurtful to him. She accepted his castration, essentially.
Oh God, I've never heard this theory. My brain is like, boom. Oh man, that's crazy.
Hi, today we're having a friendly fan debate and analysis of old versus new Bond. And the questions we're going to be asking are, what are the main differences between the different eras of the James Bond franchise? Which one of those eras was better? How did it change? And is James Bond still culturally relevant? I'm here with Carsten Knox, who is a writer and journalist. He has a blog called Flaw in the Iris, where he does film reviews. Hello, Carsten.
Hey, Lucas.
Okay, so for the purposes of this discussion, I've sort of divided, just trying to define what old Bond versus new Bond is. Old Bond is what I would consider phase one Bond from 1962 all the way to 1989, from Sean Connery all the way to Timothy Dalton. And then around that time, even though Cubby Broccoli was involved with GoldenEye, he basically had sort of turned over the reins and passed away in 96. That's where I see the first shift, the first tonal shift, where I would consider everything after that like new Bond, even though at this point it's 25 years old. And then again, what I would call phase three, which is the reboot with Daniel Craig in 2006.
Appreciate you defining that. I mean, binaries like that are attractive because it helps simplify and structure our conversation, especially since Cubby Broccoli was the sort of godfather of Bond. His sort of passing would be certainly trigger a change.
Thank you, Mr.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Ksenia Sergeyevna Onatop.
Onatop?
Onatop.
I got off the sort of the Bond train after Timothy Dalton. It's not like I didn't want to like the other movies, and I didn't go to see every movie opening night, since 1995. But to me, the movies changed, and even more so with Daniel Craig, to the point where it's not the same thing for me. So, and I think you still enjoy those movies. I think you enjoy the Brosnan and Craig movies.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as black and white as that. There are things I really enjoy about the new Bond, even the Pierce Brosnan movies. I can find plenty of things to criticize about them. But yeah, I feel like it's a series of chapters, and in my head, it's based around the actor playing the lead role. And there are things about the Craig Bonds that I like as much as almost any of the other movies in the series. Like I would say that Casino Royale is in my top 3 Bond movies of all time, easily. And in fact, the more I watch it, I've seen it maybe half a dozen times, and it just keeps going higher.
Your file shows no kills, and it takes 2.
If I was to introduce someone to James Bond, I would probably start with Casino Royale. Yeah, I just feel like, they did try to reboot the whole series there. The feeling of him still being new to the License to Kill, I really appreciated that. So yeah, I think I would start there, and then maybe go back to From Russia with Love, and then I think The Spy Who Loved Me would be the first 3 that I would show.
Right.
And then if they were still interested, then I'm like, all right, here we go. Let's start at the beginning.
I mean, everybody has different opinions, and I think at the end of the day, there's no such thing as an objective kind of like evaluation of these things. If I had to make a list, none of the new movies would ever be on the list, because to me, they're not enough James Bond.
You're breaking my heart here. I had no idea you were so critical of them.
This is what makes James Bond for me. So the tone of those movies are this tongue-in-cheek humor, this sort of larger-than-life kind of a character and world, this fantasy world, but also not too serious. It's very self-aware, and then a certain amount of innovation in the stunts and the gadgetry and that kind of stuff. So that's number one. And number two would be the character of James Bond. He's a connoisseur, he's chivalrous, he has a high-class background, he's a jet setter, and he's a charming, debonair character. And so I think in phase two, in other words, in the Brosnan era, you basically have those elements. To me, they just don't come together as well. But I think when you think of the Craig era, the character and the tone is very different. The character is not, and this is a matter of debate, but the character to me is not like a gentleman spy. He's more like a hooligan spy. So, I mean, he is a connoisseur, but he's not really chivalrous. It's debatable whether or not he has a high-class background. In Skyfall, it seemed like he's got this big house in the country, and his parents seem to be kind of well-to-do. But in Casino Royale, Vesper says, "Oh, you didn't come from money."
By the cut of your suit, you went to Oxford or wherever. Naturally think human beings dress like that. But you wear it with such disdain. My guess is you didn't come from money, and your school friends never let you forget it. Which means you were at that school by the grace of someone else's charity, hence the chip on your shoulder. And since your first thought about me ran to orphan, that's what I'd say you are.
And I don't find Craig particularly charming or debonair, and he's kind of like a hard, sort of killer character. So for me, when you remove these elements, the chivalrous, high class, charming, debonair elements of the character, then it may be an interesting character, an interesting movie, but it's not that same character to me. And and of course, it's been influenced by the Jason Bourne movies. And I think the big difference is James Bond, the old James Bond, came out of the novels, which themselves came out of this whole post-World War II era, and the commando movies. And he was just like this one-person commando, infiltrating and saving the world and that kind of stuff. And then after 9/11, spy movies really changed. It got really dark with Jason Bourne. And then also there was the Austin Powers influence, where they felt like, well, that's kind of like, we can't do that anymore because it's kind of been done because Austin Powers made fun of it. So to me, it looks a little bit like a crisis of confidence, like from the producers, like who is James Bond and how do we keep him relevant and all this kind of stuff.
Well, you pretty much made my argument for me with all the last stuff you said.
Yeah.
With 9/11 and Bourne and Powers, those were like the three elements that the Eon folks basically had to they're like, okay, so if we're going to start this again, we have to respond to that in a way that keeps the character relevant. And I think the difference between you and I is I think they did a terrific job. I think they made Bond slightly broken and psychologically damaged in a way that made him reject his upbringing. If he was toffee-nosed when he was a kid, he had a lot of rough times, and he went to the military and he did things, I guess, however he got to finally becoming the 00 licensed. I think he's not a nice guy. You're right, the chivalry is really questionable. I agree with you there, but I also don't really miss it. I feel like a certain amount of grit and realism that they try to bring to at least the character, if not the scenarios. I mean, he's still, a parkour expert, and he can do all this incredible stuff, and he can, I mean, he dies in the middle of Casino Royale, spoiler alert, and then he has in his car, the the electric shock to bring him back to life. I mean, there's still a whole bunch of this that is outrageous and ridiculous if you pick it apart in any rational way. But as far as adventure goes, the aspects to the character that I still feel work are all sort of on display there. And I think that exploring his psychology is worth doing, and I think it makes us more invested in the character. And I think all of that was the right move for Eon to do. And I mean, if the box office of Skyfall isn't evidence enough that it's been a huge success, then I don't know what else to tell you, right? I think it's worked really, really well for most audiences. The Bond has stayed relevant. The places where I disagree with some of the decision making around the Craig era is the need to connect everything to some personal aspect of his past. They started really going there with Skyfall and the end of the movie where we go back to the castle in Scotland, and I just felt like I appreciated all the other stuff they were doing, but I felt like the mystique is part of what I enjoy about Bond, and I felt like some of that was being stripped away. And then in Spectre, they made him personally connected with the villain, Blofeld, which completely unnecessary, not something that they ever did in the Sean Connery movies. And it just, it makes everything feel a little more trite. I always admired the fact that he was willing to sacrifice everything for Queen and country.
Vesper Lynd, for example.
She was the big one. Has he told you about her?
And then, of course, your beloved M, gone forever.
Me. It was all me, James. It's always been me, the author of all your pain.
For some reason, it's like I'm cross-wired and all my tastes are opposite to popular opinion. In other words, my favorite Craig movie is Quantum of Solace. I think I always enjoy watching that movie, and I can't see a flaw in that movie. And what I think I'm really attracted to is the directing of the movie, and a very interesting politics about basically imperialism and American meddling and other countries, especially in South America, and getting together and with bad people basically and then you have the Felix Leiter and sort of the more cynical bad CIA agent, and so all this kind of very interesting, which I feel is very kind of relevant and modern stuff. And I mean, and aside from that, I mean, I can't even put my finger on what I love about it, but I just always enjoy watching that movie. And I really enjoy Spectre, although I think Spectre has lots of problems, mostly in the action scenes, because I think Sam Mendes isn't an action director. So all the action scenes kind of fall flat, and you're like, well, it's a Bond movie. It's an action movie. If you don't get the action scenes right, like, it's really hard, to come back from that. But the fact that Blofeld is back and Spectre is back made me so happy. Christoph Waltz as Blofeld is amazing. And the fact that they went as far as getting the cat and all that stuff, like, I love all that stuff. I don't even mind that they're like brothers, but it seems like if the whole point is to move away from Austin Powers, that's directly from Goldmember, as Dr. Evil and Austin Powers being brothers. So I don't think that they needed to make that connection. And I think in trying to recreate James Bond for the 21st century, they kind of they go, oh, personal, that works. And then they kind of really lean hard into it. And then they lean hard into retconning everything. And I think to myself, well, some of that kind of makes sense, because it felt like they were setting that up with Mr. White and the evil organization. But then to randomly rope in Javier Bardem character, to rope him in and as being part of Spectre as well, was doesn't make any sense. If you look at the first 4 Sean Connery movies, you had Goldfinger was the outlier. He was not part of Spectre, and he could just be his own guy. He's doing his own evil thing. And then the 3 other movies were all Spectre kind of interwoven, and that was fun to do one non-Spectre movie.
I think Spectre is flawed in that they felt it necessary to connect the previous movies, everything in Hollywood has to be a cinematic universe like Marvel, and people feel more connected if there's this mythology, and there already is a mythology. They just overdid it. Mm-hmm. We already know the mythology of Bond. It's there. It's been there for 50 years. Yeah, I agree with you that didn't work for me. And I also agree with you about Quantum of Solace. I like those sort of nuances about the politics and about the way Bond's and MI6's relationship with the CIA and the sort of dirty dealings that are going on, and the fact that they'll support certain people. I think the problem with the film is, again, some of the action sequences aren't that great. I think the finale at a hotel in the desert isn't so awesome. And I think in terms of like some of the Bond tropes that still work, I think a villain like Matthew Almeric is just not all that threatening. And I really had a hard time believing that he would be any kind of physical threat to Bond. He needed a henchman or a group of henchmen, you know? He needed a Bambi and Thumper. He needed a Jaws, like someone to really give Bond a hard time. And I guess I kind of struggled with the idea that it was a direct sequel to Casino Royale, that it starts, minutes after Casino Royale, even though Bond is wearing a different suit. They never really explained that. Anyway.
I actually really like that, only because it had never been done. And I know that originally there was some criticism about it being like too camera shaky, Jason Bourne, which I didn't like as well in the beginning, but eventually all the other pieces came together, and made it work for me. But I think actually, even though there are things that I like about the Craig era, the biggest problem for me is Daniel Craig himself. I didn't go into it like trying to like hate him or going like, well, he's blonde and he should never do it. And when I saw Casino Royale, I thought he was a fantastic actor and probably the best actor to play Bond in terms of his emotional depth and all that kind of stuff. But I just don't buy him, like, ever. Like, I don't believe that guy is like a ruthless assassin. I believe that he's a really good actor playing a ruthless assassin. So I never buy it. As opposed to Sean Connery, I always buy Sean Connery being Sean Connery. And even Roger Moore. I think when Roger Moore was trying to be a little tougher, like in Man with the Golden Gun, I didn't buy that. But when he started like really leaning into the humor and the and all this kind of stuff, then I'm like, oh, that's totally, I buy it. And then when he was ruthless and he would like, kick some guy off the cliff or something, then I really bought it because you had all this humor and then the seriousness to kind of juxtapose it. And the humor doesn't generally work with Craig. And I don't know, there's just something where there's a sort of posturing element.
I mean, I don't know. I keep thinking about that shot in Skyfall where he in the opening pre-credit sequence, they're chasing the guy on the train and they have somehow figured out a way to use an earth mover to pull down the roof of the train, and he's going to jump from that onto the train. And when he does, and he lands, he straightens his cuffs. Yeah. And I just love that. I love that shot. I just think that to me is like, that is Bond right there. That is the quintessence of Bond. He does something incredibly ridiculous, almost superhuman. And, even if he's sweating, even if he's mussed his hair up, which of course never really happened to Roger Moore, but with Craig, you have to see him sweat. You have to see him hurt, more than you did previously. These days, that's just a requirement of our action heroes, I think.
And I think where they got it right in terms of the character is that they went back to the roots of Sean Connery. What was brilliant about Sean Connery's casting is that everybody thought of him as kind of this rough, like footballer kind of guy in a tuxedo. And it was a juxtaposition between this like rough, scruffy guy in a tuxedo. That's what really made it work. And the other thing that made it work, I think that's lacking from the Craig movies, is the not taking ourselves too seriously. It's like the whole thing's ridiculous, and it's supposed to be fun. And Craig movies are generally not fun. There are some fun elements in them, but everything is so tonally like heavy in terms of he's so wounded and he's so angry and they've done awful things to him and maybe he has no testicles anymore and like, you know what I mean?
Geez, that's there's a real possibility, isn't there?
Really what happens there, and if you go back and watch Casino Royale, there is some evidence to this, that basically what happens is he gets emasculated, like castrated essentially. So he can't have children anymore. And And that's why the whole thing with Vesper is so hurtful to him, is that she's willing to be with him even though he can't have children anymore. And when she betrays him, it's like, it's a double wound. It's not just that he was betrayed by this woman he loved. She accepted his castration, essentially. And
oh God, I've never heard this theory. My brain, like, boom. Oh man, that's crazy.
So that means that's why he's so flippant about sex after that, because he's like, well, I can't get anybody pregnant. And it's almost like he's trying to prove himself, his virility, like, every time he has sex with someone, he's like, well, see, I can still do it. I'm cool, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's nuts. I mean, okay, sure, I guess, but.
I just want you to know that if all there was left of you was your smile and your little finger, you'd still be more of a man than anyone I've ever met.
That's because you know what I can do with my little finger.
I think if you talk to anybody who loves the Roger Moore era, like we do, some of that love is about how fun they are and how playful and slightly campy, and how Moore changed the role. His Bond was so different than Sean Connery's Bond, which was more serious. It's funny. I guess I have enough appetite for all of it. Like, my favorite Roger Moore one is probably For Your Eyes Only, and it's the one that it's the least jokiest of them all, with the exception of the very end where Thatcher shows up, and that just.
Give us a kiss. Give us a kiss.
Oh, well, really, Mr. Bond.
But I mean, the beginning starts with him at his wife's grave, so there's some heaviness there, like when Inspector, they tried to go in that direction. I saw what they were doing and I kind of appreciated it, but at the same time, I don't think that's the tone that works for Bond as he is now. And I mean, if you can't get on board with the serious intensity of the Craig years, I mean, that's fair, I guess. But that's what works.
If you look at Casino Royale, it's basically like a prequel, like an origin story. So you get to the end of the movie and he says, I'm Bond, James Bond, and you get the music and whatever, like, okay, James Bond. And then you go right into the sequel, which is supposed to happen like 5 minutes later. And so he still seems to be trying to deal with his identity, and he's basically, M has basically fired him. He's kind of a loose cannon, and he's doing this thing. And at the end of Quantum of Solace, there's kind of that thing like, okay, Bond is back. I'm like, oh, okay, Bond is back. Great, he's back. And then when you get to Skyfall at the beginning, oh, now it's like he's old and he's like established character. And then you get to the end of that movie, and then suddenly you have the new M and the old Office and and then you got the music and everything. And now I feel like that movie's saying, now Bond is back. So it's 3 movies in a row that end in that same.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. Structurally, you're right. And that's, it's a shame that it's so repetitive in that regard. And you feel like they keep establishing details that they don't, and then the subsequent movies are not paying off. But if there is something to be critical of in those Craig Bonds, it's that they don't feel free enough to just throw all that stuff away. As much as I enjoy the new Q and the new Moneypenny and the new M, yeah, there is this balance between doing something that seems new and different, but also making sure that people recognize it as a Bond movie. And some of that has been a bit clumsy, because they kind of want their cake and eat it too, I think.
Yeah, and by the time they get the Spectre, they're kind of fully leaning into it. But which on one hand I love that Spectre and Blofeld's back and they're white dinner jackets and all that stuff, but it's kind of like a 180 weird like turn, and Craig seems like lost in this kind of Roger Moore kind of retro movie where he's like, I don't know what my character is anymore. I thought I was mad,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I don't agree with in terms of the problem with that movie. The problem with that movie is the action sequences aren't terribly inspired, and they have thrown so much money at it that it just feels bloated. It's my least favorite of the Craig batch. But when I think about Casino Royale, like a third of the movie is spent in a casino, which is amazing. Like the suspense and the mission and the fact that he's got to try to win this money from this international terrorist who's played by Mads Mikkelsen. I mean, you know, that to me feels as true to Bond as anything that's ever been. What I'm looking for from a Bond movie, that delivers 100%.
So let's talk about Pierce Brosnan era a little bit.
I mean, I enjoyed those movies, but there was a little bit of like a, you know, we're going to just do the same thing again. And there was a boilerplate quality to a lot of Brosnan that going back, I still struggle to distinguish one movie from another, like what was going on and who the villains were. And sometimes I've seen them many times, but they just sort of bleed together. But I will say this about it. I think as Bond, Brosnan was a really good choice. I think he had a lot of the elements that the character required. And I think he was really, he brought forward the character into the 90s. And there was a lot of like post-Cold War geopolitical elements that I really enjoyed about the way those movies were constructed and the way they worked. But I think the best Pierce Brosnan Bond movie was the first one, was GoldenEye. I think it was a little bit too long, but it was really well done. And but unfortunately for Pierce Brosnan, I think he got better with the character. I think his best movie, his best performance is Die Another Day, but it's the worst of his movies. So he's getting more serious and more intense, and he's bringing more to the character as he goes along, which makes sense because he's getting more comfortable. But the movie just goes off the rails, doesn't support him in a way. Like it starts so well, Die Another Day, with him being held a prisoner of war for a year in North Korea, which I thought was a great twist. And then, you know, we get to the nonsense with the melting ice hotel and the invisible car and the surfing on a CGI tsunami. And it's just like, ugh, there's just so much about it that's bad. But yeah, so it's this weird like tension for me. It's like the movie started well and then get consecutively worse, but he started okay and then gets consecutively better. So yeah, that's my theory about the Brosnan Bonds.
Well, it's funny, as you were saying that, it kind of reminds me of Batman and during the 90s versus Batman in the 2000s. You know, the people like Tim Burton, Batman, and all this sort of stuff. But to me, none of those movies really worked. Although I do enjoy them, they didn't really work because it's like they needed to pick a lane. Are we doing dark and broody, or are we doing campy fun?
Right.
And it's sort of Tim Burton's fault because he started off in this really weird tone where he was trying to thread this needle between those two things. And to me, to buy Batman, you got to buy into the realism of the character. I mean, he's a guy that dresses up as a bat. It's ridiculous. But if you can make me believe that that's a real thing, then you got me, and it's going to be a great movie. But they didn't even try. They were just like, man, it was just bad. And yeah, he solves things. And he's supposed to be a detective, and he's not even detecting half the time. He's just... Yeah. So,
yes.
Christopher Nolan came along, and when I saw those movies, I had zero expectations for Batman Begins. Didn't even go see it in the theater. And then when I actually watched it, I'm like, holy shit, this is what I've been waiting for my whole life. I totally believe this guy. I totally believe his whole progression emotionally. And Morgan Freeman's kind of like a cute character, and he's kind of like making his gadgets for him. And suddenly everything makes sense. Everything is rooted in some sort of reality. And then we're off to the races for the next two movies. You're just really having a good time. You're not even thinking, is it a superhero movie? You're just having, it's so grounded in its reality. And even if it's fantastical, it's always grounded and very consistent. But I think with the Pierce Brosnan Bond movies, it was the same sort of, we don't know how we're supposed to do this, you know? I think Cubby Broccoli had been doing it for so long, and he was grounded in his own experience that even when you got a new actor and a new decade and new whatever, it's always came back to the same elements. And also, you know, there was a consistency in the writing of the writers, is what I mean. Richard Maybaum, like, he died in 1990, and he had a hand in almost every James Bond movie, you know. And then and Michael Wilson worked with him and all this, so you had sort of with Cubby Broccoli and Richard Maybaum and all that, you had a certain kind of like tone and consistency. Even though Roger Moore is very different from Sean Connery, tonally there's this very clear overlap, and also structurally every movie is kind of impeccable because it's kind of like a kindergarten structure. There's a bad guy, he's got to stop the bad guy, and there's like bad guys that are trying to stop him, and every movie has a theme. There's the gold theme, there's the underwater theme, there's the Japan theme, there's the Alps theme, there's the so on and so forth. And then you get to Pierce Brosnan and they're like, I don't know what we're doing. Like basically
Michael Wilson had hands on all of those late Roger Moore movies, so he continued into the 90s. So I never really felt like oh, we're into this different era now because Cubby is gone. I mean, for me, and I'm going to say this, and I think that you're going to find this shocking, Lucas, because I don't think I've ever said this before, but as much as I admire what Timothy Dalton tried to bring to Bond by trying to make him more gritty and more realistic in his movies, I find his movies incredibly boring. Like, I never watch the Dalton Bonds. I just feel like we could have gone from Roger Moore to Pierce Brosnan and missed Dalton altogether, and the mythos of the Bond movies we wouldn't have missed anything, because I frankly, they are really dull. Mm-hmm. The late 80s was a terrible time for James Bond. I really missed the bombast. And I think to some extent, Brosnan movies at least had that. Like, they did have big sets. They did have big explosions. They had outsized villains that were almost cartoonish. So.
Yeah, and I think some elements did work, but I think to me that was the same problem of like the Batman movies, sort of picking a lane. Like, at least the Craig era, they've picked a lane,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But and I think that's what makes it muddled. One second it was outlandish, and the next second, like, I like Die Another Day, but you make a good point. It was like this super gritty, I'm gonna get tortured in a North Korean prison for a year and come out. Yeah. And then later you're surfing on a CGI tsunami. It's tonally, it's like pick a lane, like have fun with it if you want to have fun, and then, or be serious if you want to be serious. But that's what didn't work for me, is that I just was never grounded in any of those movies to give a shit, like, because I can get on board with one or the other, but I can't get on board with if you're doing both at the same time.
Right.
Okay, I'll say some positive things. You're right. Pierce Brosnan, great actor, great choice to play James Bond. Not given good enough material, I feel like. But he just was especially in GoldenEye, he was really good at being Roger Moore and Sean Connery in a way. Like, there was that scene where he captures Xenia Onatopp and then gives her a little in the back of the neck, and he's got this like really angry face on. He's like, it's like pure Sean Connery. And then there's the other times where he's in the casino, he's like doing this thing, and he's like totally Roger Moore, and also he's being himself. He's being Pierce Brosnan. And I think every actor, if they can just pull a little bit from what's come before, I think that sort of bridging sort of the continuity, in terms of the character. And I think that's part of the problem with Daniel Craig, is that he doesn't really pull from anybody else. I mean, that's not a bad thing, but that's something I was always looking forward to, is that sort of character thread going from actor to actor. Despite everything I've said, I'm really looking forward to the next James Bond movie.
Well, every day is, as they say on the Empire podcast, every day is Christmas, right? You can always, when the film hasn't arrived yet, you can always dream about what it's going to deliver for you, and if it's going to be able to fit into your expectations of what this character you've watched your whole life could potentially be.
From the trailers, it seemed like to me like, okay, we're gonna do a proper James Bond movie. We're gonna do like somebody who wants to destroy the world. He's got to like stop the person. And and now that it's supposedly supposed to be Daniel Craig's last movie, I'm kind of wondering, well, what's the future of Bond gonna be? What's gonna be the new Bond? Are they gonna do a reboot again? Are they gonna do some prequels? Are they gonna do some remakes? I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
My feeling is, if I thought about it, like, there is an opportunity to do a reboot that starts where he's a much younger character, But having done sort of a soft reboot with Craig at the beginning of his career as a 007 agent, I sort of feel like it might feel repetitive to do that again. Whatever they do next, I feel like they need to feel a little more free to mix it up. And maybe it's doing the thing that, you know, the Eon producers have had such a grip on what they want James Bond to be. Maybe it's time for them to pair up with like a genuinely maverick filmmaker who wants to do their own take on what Bond is. And even if it means that some of the continuity is shattered, that might be exciting.
So what do you apply for that job?
Oh, come on. I mean, if it was you, but you would make a Bond movie like they made in the mid-70s, wouldn't you?
But at this point, that's like a maverick movie. If you drive a Lotus, it'd be like, whoa, that's like, I haven't seen that coming.